Live from the University of Texas at Austin, the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the Department of Government present U.S. Foreign Policy with your professors, Rob Moser and Pat McDonald.
Welcome back to U.S. Foreign Policy. For our third news segment of the semester, we're going to tackle an issue that intersects with previous modules on U.S. grand strategy and many of the themes that we're going to talk about all semester. We're going to discuss some controversial comments made by Donald Trump regarding NATO that suggested that he would not defend NATO allies from Russian invasion unless they spent 2% of their gross domestic product on national defense, which is the target for NATO countries. And in fact, he went even farther than that, implying that he would encourage Russia to attack NATO allies unless they spent that 2%. We're also going to analyze how these comments intersect with the adjacent debate surrounding a new bill on foreign aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan that was passed by the Senate but is stalled in the U.S. House of Representatives. We're going to examine these two developments, Trump's comments and the continuing debate on foreign aid through the prism of competing grand strategies that are beginning to divide political leaders both across the Democratic and Republican parties and within them.
Let me just intervene here and bring up one other recent development, the death of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny this week too, which kind of dovetails with these developments in the sense that it is another piece of evidence about the authoritarian and repressive nature of the Russian state and Vladimir Putin. His death is suspicious to say the least, and comes about a month before Russian presidential elections that will surely, that will surely is already decided through because they are fraudulent and a joke. Let's just call it that. This dovetails with especially the debate between the two political parties and these comments. And aid to Ukraine, because it is just another point that those who are blocking aid to Ukraine have to justify because of a politically inspired death of the most prominent dissident in Russia in the last 2 decades.
So today we're going to do 5 things. First, we're going to examine the controversy over Donald Trump's comments about NATO and foreign aid in general, and examine some of the reactions to them. Second, we will update you on developments surrounding aid to Ukraine, since the bill now focuses exclusively on foreign aid rather than aid and border security. The debate over whether to continue aid to Ukraine or end it has become front and center. After that, we will take a step back and provide some background on the broader debate over the role of the United States in the world after the Cold War. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, ending the Cold War, both parties and each U.S. president has been challenged to articulate America's defining mission, its grand strategy, now that the singular great power adversary of the Soviet Union had disintegrated. Fourth, in light of this broader debate over grand strategy, we're going to return to the issue of aid to Ukraine and outline the strategic arguments for and against continued military aid to Ukraine. And finally, we'll close with some speculation on how the rest of the world is reacting to the prolonged domestic debate over whether the United States will continue to arm Ukraine, and more broadly, if it will remain committed to its alliance commitments that are now almost 75 years old. All right, so let's get started with the news.
International news now.
Okay, we are going to start with the controversy that erupted after Donald Trump made controversial comments on his attitude toward defending NATO allies who are not spending at least 2% of their gross domestic product, their GDP, on defense. Now, let me just state that that's not a legally binding target, by the way, of the agreement over within NATO. It's a target. Now, we're going to start this section with a clip from the PBS Newshour that shows the actual quote itself. So let's roll that clip now.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. Once again, former President Donald Trump's remarks in a campaign speech are drawing fire from both allies around the world and rivals in the United States. Yesterday in South Carolina, Trump said he told NATO countries that as president, he would encourage Russian aggression if they don't pay what they owe the alliance.
And I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
The head of NATO said Trump's comments put U.S. and European forces at risk. The White House called his words appalling and unhinged. Nikki Haley, Trump's top remaining Republican rival, fired back on CBS's Face the Nation.
Don't take the side of a thug who kills his opponents. Don't take the side of someone who has gone in and invaded a country and 500,000 people have died or been wounded because of Putin. Now, we do want NATO allies to pull their weight, but there are ways you can do that without sitting there and telling Russia, have your way with these countries. That's not what we want.
All right, just a few points. First, the basic content of these comments are not new for Donald Trump, and that actually is really important to note. He has voiced a long-standing complaint that many NATO member states fall short of the spending target of 2% of GDP on defense, and also this is not the first time that Trump has implied that the United States would be less inclined or would refuse to follow through on its commitments to defend a NATO country that is not spending 2% on defense, suggesting that the security commitment of NATO, that an attack on one member state is an attack on all, and so all would work to defend the state under attack, is contingent, is conditional on defense spending. What made the comments controversial was the provocative language that Trump used. He said he would not just, refuse to defend or be skeptical or what have you, but he would encourage one of the country's fiercest adversaries to invade the United States NATO allies, or some of them, if they didn't pay a sufficient amount of their gross domestic product toward defense. Now, let me also say that the controversy did not stop with these single comments. Trump doubled down on his NATO comment later with a social media post that also ran counter to longstanding U.S. foreign policy regarding foreign aid. U.S. foreign aid is given as grants, if you will, to countries without expectation of repayment. Trump's post read, and I don't know, no, I don't have it in, well, it's the quote here is on the slide. It read in part, from this point forward, and then he puts, are you listening, U.S. Senate? So this is a comment about the aid package to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan that the Senate was then considering. No money in the form of foreign aid should be given to any country unless it is done as a loan. All right. Now, it should be noted that the whole post includes some caveats that weaken the position somewhat, right? He said the loans could be on extraordinary terms with no interest and no date for repayment, which sort of sounds like loans that I give my kids. Loans, in quotation marks. But, and this is the key thing, he argues that if the country turns against the United States or strikes it rich, those were his words, the loan would need to be paid off. Of course, such a policy would be very difficult to enforce. Now, it seems the point here that Trump is making when he says these things is to characterize foreign aid as charity and a burden that does not serve U.S. interests. However, critics who have a different worldview and a different grand strategy argue the opposite. And this is what's really fundamentally important and distinctive about comments like this. Those with a more internationalist worldview and a grand strategy that sees U.S. interests more broadly than just within its country or along its borders. That foreign aid is not charity, but rather should be viewed as an investment that furthers U.S. security as well as the security of the recipient countries. And alliances, especially NATO, are one of the primary assets that make the U.S. stronger than adversaries like Russia, who have fewer and weaker allies, or China for that matter. And so the problem with this quote, and I'd like to hear your comment about this, is that it disparages these alliances where, from the viewpoint of many, including myself, I'll admit, it fails to see that one of the things that enables the United States to maintain its national security and its ability to project influence and power abroad is alliance systems with powerful and, I'll admit, wealthy countries in Europe and Asia. And that's what gives it a distinct advantage over its adversaries.
Yes. One of the primary reasons you have alliances is to eliminate adversaries and enemies in the international system. And so if you're on good terms with a lot of states, then you don't have to worry about them as being a threat to you. One of the ways that you build good relations and good ties and encourage and support governments in power in allied countries is by offering foreign aid. And to sustain long-term political situations in those countries that ensure that they will remain allied to you and not be a threat in the future. The United States learned this lesson the hard way in the 1920s and the 1930s when it failed to extend aid to Europe and to stabilize democracy in the Weimar Republic, which led to the takeover by the Nazi Party and created a huge long-term security investment cost to the United States.
Much more costly than the original
yes,
investment.
And that's the point. Foreign aid is a lot cheaper to pay before the war hits.
Right.
The other thing to keep in mind about all this is the United States government is not a bank. It's a government, okay? So we don't worry about whether we're spending $4 to $6 billion out of a GDP of $23 to $24 trillion if that, and in this case, let's be clear about it, $100 billion for Ukraine, much more sizable, but if that $100 billion prevents the conquest of Ukraine and includes and keeps Ukraine into Europe, NATO alliance structure, and then prevents an attack on another NATO member in the future that would, and again, if there was an attack on the NATO member, could lead to the United States being in a war.
With troops on the ground.
With troops on the ground. Right. The argument is this $100 billion is cheaper than losing tens of thousands of lives of European citizens and American citizens.
And that's the different, there's a different worldview and grand strategy here that has to be kept in mind regarding, overall commitments to alliance structures. So, all right, let's move on.
All right.
Your turn.
So, as one might expect, President Biden immediately denounced Trump's comments as irresponsible and dangerous. Democrats and European leaders echoed these objections. What was more interesting were the various reactions from Republican leaders. The most common reaction was the one we're about to see in our next clip. Most Republicans didn't so much defend Trump's statements as minimize their significance. So let's see what this looked like with a clip from an interview with Marco Rubio on CNN's State of the Union Sunday morning show. Let's roll that clip now.
Endorsed Donald Trump. Are you comfortable with him suggesting that he wouldn't defend NATO countries and actually he would invite Putin and Russia to invade them?
Well, that's not what happened, and that's not how I view that statement. I mean, he was talking about a story that he talked about happened in the past. By the way, Donald Trump was president, and he didn't pull us out of NATO. In fact, American troops were stationed throughout Europe, as they are today. They were then as well. But he's telling a story, and frankly, look, Donald Trump is not a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He doesn't talk like a traditional politician. And we've already been through this now. You'd think people had figured it out by now. What he's basically saying is, if you see the comments, he said NATO was broke or busted until he took over because people weren't paying their dues. And then he told the story about how he used leverage to get people to step up to the plate and become more active in NATO. He's not the first American president. In fact, virtually every American president at some point in some way has complained about other countries in NATO not doing enough. Trump's just the first one to express it in these terms. But I have zero concern because he's been president before. I know exactly what he has done and will do with the NATO alliance. But there has to be an alliance. It's not America's defense with a bunch of small junior partners. Some of these are big countries with big economies. Many of them are doing more. The Germans are doing a lot right now.
So Rubio, like most other Republicans, doesn't defend Trump's statements or say he agrees with them. Rather, he makes two arguments. First, he says that Trump doesn't talk like other politicians. He uses coarser language that should not be taken literally. Second, Rubio defends Trump by focusing on the policies he followed during his term. He says, for example, that the U.S. did not withdraw from NATO while Donald Trump was president. He claims that he is not worried that Trump would undermine NATO in his second term. One should note, though, that Marco Rubio was instrumental in placing language in the latest annual defense policy bill that says the following: the U.S. president, quote, shall not suspend, terminate, denounce, or withdraw the United States from the North Atlantic Treaty, unquote, without either a supermajority vote in the Senate or an act passed by the full Congress. Many argue that this language, which had bipartisan support, was intended to constrain Trump from withdrawing from NATO if he's reelected.
Yeah, it applies to everybody, but let's face it, they're thinking about some person.
However, there were some Republicans who took Trump's comments more seriously and were critical. Nikki Haley, his sole remaining competitor in the Republican presidential primary, was one. Christie, who was Trump's strongest critic in the Republican primary before he dropped out, was another. So we're now going to watch a clip from Meet the Press of an interview with Christie that captures these arguments. So go ahead and play that clip now.
What do you make of that?
Well, look, this is why I've been saying for a long time that he's unfit to be president of the United States. Now, it's one thing, and I think it's right for a president to say to a NATO member, hey, you got to pay the dues you need to pay. I think the American people would expect that of a president. But the problem with Donald Trump is he can't just stop there. He's got to say, I would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they wanted to you. That is absolutely inappropriate for a president of the United States or a candidate for president of the United States to be saying, but it is consistent with his love for dictators.
It's inappropriate. Do you think it poses a national security risk to make that kind of a comment?
What poses a national security risk is the possibility that he could be president of the United States again. Yeah. That's what poses the national security risk, because we need to take him at his word, Kristen. And the fact is that, as I've said earlier, Donald Trump, when he came into office in 2016, was scared. He was afraid to be president. He was afraid of mistakes he would make. He knew he was not ready. And so as a result, he listened to a lot of very good people around him, like General Mattis, General Kelly, and others, about these issues. In a second term, he would not.
So Christie provides a very different perspective on these statements. He argues that during his first term, former President Trump purposefully surrounded himself with foreign policy advisors with a lot of experience and ties to the military. He deferred to them because he knew he needed help with an area in which he was not well versed in. Christie and others have argued that it was these advisors who talked Trump out of withdrawing from NATO or otherwise undermining it. Christie now warns that Trump should be taken at his word, because in a second term, Trump will feel more confident on foreign policy and will appoint advisors that either share his vision or will not push back. Since he will not be constrained by advisors committed to U.S. alliances, Trump will be more likely to follow through on his long-held negative terms on the value of American alliances.
So I think this is a crucial point, right? Because this will be the discourse during the campaign, right? There'll be these two sort of perspectives on statements like this, and one has to decide how you're going to take it. And I think that Christie's point about the difference between a second Trump term and a first Trump term is crucial. Arguably, they may, those who endorsed Trump made similar comments about him when he ran in 2016 as well, saying, well, you can't take these things literally, things like that. And so, it's important to know. Now, we want to begin to draw some connections here between those comments by Donald Trump about NATO and the current debate surrounding aid to Ukraine. Now, in the second INN at UT, we covered a bill that combined foreign aid for Ukraine and Israel with significant policy changes on border security. That deal was deemed by many commentators to be more favorable to the conservative position on border security. However, it collapsed and was defeated in a vote in the U.S. Senate after former President Donald Trump strongly opposed the plan. Now, in the aftermath of the collapse of that plan, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer enacted a backup plan to secure military aid for Ukraine and Israel by stripping the border security measures out of the bill and putting up a bill containing only foreign aid for a vote. The bill also faced intense opposition from Donald Trump. This bill, right, the one currently under consideration, and the conservative wing of the Republican Party. However, this time a significant number of Republican senators broke ranks with Trump and supported the bill. The House of Representatives, with its slim Republican majority, now faces the decision whether to bring the bill up for a vote. So we're going to start with a clip from Bloomberg News that describes the timeline and the politics that followed the collapse of the deal linking Ukraine aid with stronger border security and the development of this foreign aid, alone bill. So go ahead and run that clip.
Mike, just to begin with you, if the White House and Mike Johnson aren't going to talk, and the House, in fact, is heading out of town after tomorrow, last vote is Thursday at 2:30 p.m. They won't be back until February 28th. It feels like the supplemental package is going nowhere fast in the other chamber.
Well, right now it looks like a very tough situation in the House for the Ukraine aid. It's possible that over time they could use this kind of convoluted process called a discharge petition, where you slowly get a majority to sign a petition to force it. There's some problems with that. And as you say, they're taking a 2-week vacation now before they even come back and start on that.
One of the problems with that could be progressive Democrats. It's interesting. We're not just counting Republican votes, but progressives who are not happy about Joe Biden's policy toward Israel. There are billions for Israel in this legislation. Is that what's going to really stop this from happening?
Well, it's a combination of how many progressives are too upset with the campaign in Gaza and the civilian casualties there. We don't know how many there will be, but we know there'll be at least some that wouldn't sign on to this. And then on the other hand, there are these kind of national security Republicans. How many of them are willing to kind of stand up and possibly be the target of like Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans, which are their primary base voters? So these two like little dials, we don't know where they're going to go. But we do know one thing. It's going to be slow, delayed, while Ukraine needs aid if they go this route.
Well, and much will depend on the decisions of Speaker Johnson, who we know has a very close relationship with the aforementioned Donald Trump. And we heard from the Speaker on this package this morning. Take a listen.
We are not going to be forced into action by the Senate, who in the latest product they sent us over does not have one word in the bill about America's border. So what we're doing right now is the House is working its will. The House Republican Conference, we just met an hour ago with all the members, and there are lots of ideas on the table of how to address these issues. We will address the issues. We'll do our duty on that matter, and all that begins in earnest right now.
But Julie, fine, maybe this bill doesn't have a word on the border, but there was a bill that had many words on the border. It was a border deal, and the House said we don't want it. Help us make sense of this.
Well, this one's a tough one to make sense of. This is one that Republicans are going to have to answer about, and you can just look at last night's election to show for that. I mean, the Democrats did pass in the Senate a border bill. The Republicans said no after saying we want a border bill that went further than many have in the past. This now becomes an election issue. This is something that the Speaker is going to be asked about, especially right now.
All right, so first, let me summarize what is in this new bill. The bill now has a singular focus on foreign aid with no additional measures concerning border security. Ironically, This is the approach that the Biden administration and the Democrats wanted in the first place. They preferred to keep the issue of foreign aid for Ukraine and Israel separate from other policies such as border security. Adding border security was a demand of the Republicans until later it was rejected by them. By the Republicans. Now, the core elements of the bill are as follows. The total amount is approximately $95 billion. Most of this, $60 billion, goes to Ukraine, with most of that $60 billion amount going for military aid. The bill also includes $14 billion to Israel, $10 billion in humanitarian aid in Gaza and other humanitarian crises, and $4 billion to Taiwan. That doesn't add up to $95 billion, by the way, because there's a few other things in there.
We just pause for a second here? Yeah. So those numbers, $60 billion going to Ukraine, with most amount going for military aid. Guess where that money is spent? On American defense contractors. So that's money that's actually being spent in the United States. Just wanted to say this. This isn't giving money away. This is giving money to Ukraine to spend on military efforts, and then what do? They buy military hardware from American defense contractors. Just want to say that.
And there is some point to be made here, too, about the singular necessity of the United States doing this, because it's the only country that can. The idea that, well, why doesn't Europe just give them the weapons? It's because they just don't have the infrastructure to do it, or they're trying to develop that, but that's years down the road. The only country that can provide the military aid that Ukraine needs right now is the United States. If you look at all the aid that goes to Ukraine, Europe is actually providing more overall aid to Ukraine than the United States. Now, this foreign aid only bill faced serious obstacles, just like the previous bill linking aid to border security. Donald Trump came out against it. That's was the point, in part, of the social media post about making all foreign aid in the form of loans. That's why he sent that. He was interested in thwarting this bill. However, in a bit of a surprise, at least to me, the Senate passed the bill by a relatively wide margin, 70 to 29, gaining substantial bipartisan support. 22 Senate Republicans and all the Democrats, except for three, there are 3 Democrats who voted against that bill, passed this bill. The Republicans that supported the bill included Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and other members of the Republican leadership in the state. Our Texas Senator John Cornyn also voted for the bill. The Democratic senators who opposed the bill did so to protest or refused to support aid to Israel, which they argued produced too many Palestinian casualties in its war in Gaza. Now the bill goes to the House of Representatives next, where the bill faces even greater opposition, as seen in the clip, from the Republican majority there. House Speaker Mike Johnson has signaled that he will not bring that bill to a vote in the House, arguing in part that it includes no provisions to strengthen border security. Now, this argument is much harder to make now, of course, because the deal with border security measures collapsed in large part because Johnson himself said it would be dead on arrival in the House. Now, as the clip points out, Johnson has called for a one-on-one meeting with himself and President Biden, presumably to negotiate stronger border security provisions that, stronger border security provisions than was included in the original deal that was negotiated in the Senate. It's unclear what sort of border security deal could be acceptable to both sides at this point. I don't think that's going anywhere. Instead, I would argue, at least, that the only viable route to aid to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan seems to be this standalone foreign aid bill. Given Johnson's current position of not bringing it up for a vote, it faces a long and difficult path in the House at best. Some commentators, though, have pointed to an obscure legislative maneuver called a discharge petition as one way that the House could bypass the Speaker and force a vote. Now, a discharge petition is a long and risky process. First, the legislation must sit in a committee for 30 days, but the most difficult part of this, a discharge petition requires that the sponsors of the petition collect signatures from a majority of House members to force a vote on the legislation. So that majority would be 218 votes, and so would require some Republicans, in addition to a large majority of Democrats, to sign this petition. And of course, the signatures are made public, so this is a political risk, especially for Republicans whose leadership has and whose presidential candidate has opposed this legislation. Now, also remember that some Democrats might not sign on because of the provisions for aid to Israel. So the number of Republicans needed to pass this discharge petition, the number of signatures would be even greater than the few if they had all the Democratic members' support. So it's a long shot.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of laid out some of these recent developments, we want to take a step back and think through some of the contextual background that animates this debate, or that's forgotten in this debate. Let me start with the paradox of the end of the Cold War. U.S. military and economic hegemony overcame the Soviet threat by outperforming its political, economic, and military systems. U.S. national security and the security of its allies, particularly NATO allies in Europe, increased dramatically with the breakup of the Warsaw Pact and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, at the same time, the demise of its long-term adversary meant that the U.S. role in the post-Cold War global order was uncertain. If it wasn't containing the Soviet Union and communism, what was the mission of U.S. foreign policy? In the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War and before the rise of China, there was a desire for a peace dividend in which the United States could consider reducing the costs of American hegemony. Both Democratic and Republican presidents promised some reduction in global military commitments. In the 1996 presidential election, Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. In the 1992 presidential election,
right.
Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush in part by promising to focus like a laser beam on the domestic economy. In the 2000 election, George W. Bush promised to end nation-building interventions of his predecessor, President Clinton, although he changed his mind about 18 months later. Barack Obama won election after 2 terms of the Bush presidency by campaigning against the war in Iraq. Donald Trump campaigned against forever wars perpetrated by both Republican and Democratic presidents. Joe Biden withdrew American troops from Afghanistan. However, most of these presidents also felt compelled to continue to maintain U.S. military and economic hegemony. Clinton expanded NATO by including new members from Eastern Europe. President Bush invaded Afghanistan and Iraq in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in 2001. President Obama continued the war in Afghanistan and intervened in conflicts in both Libya and Syria. Biden is strongly supporting Ukraine and Israel with military aid and has built up alliances in response to the rise of China. At least in terms of rhetoric, the Trump administration and its America First foreign policy is distinctive among post-Cold War presidents. More than the others, Trump has criticized American military and economic alliances and the idea of liberal internationalism itself. He has advocated for what he has called a nationalist approach to foreign policy that prioritizes America's interests and defines them outside or even in opposition to the interests of its allies. As Marco Rubio said in a previous clip, this rhetoric did not produce a dramatic break in America's military alliances. He did not withdraw from NATO or other security pacts. Trump also showed some ideological flexibility that included a willingness to build on alliances, such as his efforts in the Abraham Accords to improve relations between Israel and its neighbors. The big question is whether a second Trump term would produce a sharper break. If reelected, would Trump end support for Ukraine and negotiate a quick end to the war on terms favorable to Russia? How would he handle China and Taiwan or conflict in the Middle East? In a second term, would Donald Trump be more likely to act on his reservations about the value of U.S. alliances than he was in his first term? I think it's also important to ask how alliance members and the rest of the world is viewing this potential shift. And alliance members, Europe, Russia, they expect that if Trump was reelected, he would realign U.S. foreign policy. Right. They expect that he would withdraw the United States from NATO, or if he's legislatively prohibited from legally withdrawing support from NATO, would institute significant changes in military policy through executive order that would dramatically undermine U.S. commitment to alliance partners. So the rest of the world is acting as they expect a significant change in U.S. foreign policy if Trump were elected.
That's why
in
the
November.
words matter.
Yes.
Exactly. All right. So now we want to move from this broader discussion to the more specific debate over competing strategic arguments for and against continued aid to Ukraine. Now, my opinion is that much of the current rhetoric one sees in the media surrounding military aid for Ukraine is dominated by emotional and moral arguments rather than strategic ones. What I want to do here is to attempt at least to cover the competing strategic arguments on U.S. aid to Ukraine. And I'm going to start with a short rundown of what I consider four primary positions in this debate. Granted, there are many other caveats that differentiate the positions of individual policymakers. For example, as we saw and continue to see in some respects, many Republicans argue that they support aid to Ukraine but demand it be paired with much stronger border security measures, although they balked at the option when it was in concrete terms. However, I want to concentrate on something a bit different. I want to concentrate on the underlying positions and assumptions marking greater or less support for military aid to Ukraine taken in isolation. Why and in what ways do those who object to aid to Ukraine make their arguments, and those who want to continue aid to Ukraine make those arguments? And so I placed these four positions on a continuum. The first position is a minority one, found mostly among very conservative Republicans in this context. Those holding this position have always opposed U.S. aid to Ukraine. And this position argues that Ukraine is simply not a vital interest for the United States. If Russia invades and controls Ukraine, according to their perspective, it would not significantly harm U.S. national security. They assume that Russia will either stop at Ukraine or that the U.S. can contain future Russian aggression against other neighbors through NATO, perhaps. So that is a position that is out there. The second position, moving right along the continuum, also supports ending or sharply reducing aid to Ukraine. However, the logic of this option is a bit different. From this perspective, the war is currently in a stalemate. Ukraine has no viable way to achieve its military aims and will eventually lose to its larger and stronger adversary. Consequently, the U.S., according to this perspective, should end its support because of those sort of facts on the ground. We're going to explore this position a bit more in just a second. The third position also assumes that the war is a stalemate and also believes that Ukraine has a little chance to regain all the territory it lost to Russia. However, this position argues the opposite, argues that the U.S. should continue its support for Ukraine because it helps avoid a worst-case scenario, Ukraine's total defeat by Russia, and has benefits for the future. And so we're going to analyze a bit more deeply this position as well. I would say that those two sort of positions are the dominant ones in the emerging debate over aid for Ukraine. Finally, the fourth position is that Ukraine can win the war and achieve all of its war aims, including regaining all of its territory, at least since the beginning of the current conflict in 2022. As a result, the U.S. should continue to support and do what it can to help achieve these goals. The latest battlefield failures by Ukraine, including a failed counteroffensive in 2023, has made this a minority position as well. So, to conclude, after 2 years of war, the primary debate is between two positions in the middle of the continuum I just laid out. And so before we get into those two arguments, let me just briefly tell you why there's a growing consensus that the war between Russia and Ukraine is at a stalemate. Most analysts believe this, that the war is likely to remain in stalemate, with neither Ukraine or Russia achieving a decisive victory. Now, this is built on the assumption that the West will continue to arm Ukraine. If the West doesn't continue to arm Ukraine, then the stalemate will likely diminish or collapse. And why does everybody think, or the vast majority of commentators think, that it's in stalemate? It's very simple. Both sides have, at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of movement on both sides. Russia pushed, in the very beginning of the war, pushed across Ukraine and gained a lot of territory, but then stalled out when it tried to attack and overcome Kyiv, the capital. But then Ukraine won some very decisive victories, pushed back the Russian forces in a counteroffensive that was surprisingly effective. And so there was a lot of movement. But then in the second year of the war, both sides sort of dug in their positions, and especially the Russian side was much more effective at defending its acquired territory and digging in and placing a bunch of defensive obstacles, right? And so then Ukraine's attempt to further push into Russian-dominated territory failed, and Russia's attempts to make more advances in an offensive of its own failed as well. And so that's why there's this sense that neither side right now, if everything stays as it is, assuming Western military aid for Ukraine continues, can achieve all of its war aims. And because of that stalemate, eventually it's assumed that the conflict will end with some sort of negotiated settlement in which neither side gets everything at once. The strategic arguments for and against continued aid to Ukraine then center on how the United States can incentivize both sides to negotiate eventually, and what that negotiated settlement might look like. And the different conclusions of the two strategic arguments, based on the assumption of stalemate, stems from contradictory assumptions regarding how Ukraine and Russia will react to decisions by the United States to either continue aid, military aid for Ukraine, or end military aid to Ukraine.
All right, so now let's summarize the arguments for and against aid to Ukraine, assuming that the conflict is in a stalemate with neither side able to achieve its maximal goals. I'll start with the argument for continuing aid to Ukraine. The argument that the U.S. should continue aid to Ukraine, even though the war is stalemated, rests on several assumptions. The first assumption is that U.S. military aid is essential to maintaining the status quo and avoiding Ukrainian setbacks or even complete defeat. While this may appear as an unwelcome burden, advocates of this position argue that the United States also benefits greatly from this relationship. The U.S. has not committed any soldiers in the battle yet, and the principal adversary of Russia, their military capabilities is sharply degraded, and its imperial ambitions can be thwarted by continuing military aid. Military aid sustains these gains at a cost that the United States can afford. Second, this position assumes that Ukraine must have a say in when to start negotiations and on what terms. There's a moral component to this argument, since Ukraine has its very survival as a sovereign state at stake and has borne all the most important costs of the conflict in terms of casualties and destruction. But there's also a pragmatic dimension as well. The U.S. cannot mandate that Ukrainians stop fighting, and thus cannot cut a deal with Russia to end the conflict that excludes the Ukrainian government. Third, this position assumes that Russian President Vladimir Putin is not yet ready to negotiate in good faith. Despite the high number of killed and wounded Russian soldiers, over 300,000 at this point, Putin...
300,000?
Yes.
That's a lot.
Yes. Putin clearly intends to continue the war in hopes of outlasting the West. Thus, any negotiated settlement at this point will not potentially endure. Finally, this position assumes that the costs of Ukrainian defeat outweigh the costs of even prolonged U.S. military aid to Ukraine. If the U.S. shows it lacks the political will to defend Ukraine, Russia will be emboldened and may attack other neighbors, specifically NATO neighbors. Thus, continued military aid achieves these goals by first demonstrating to Russia that the U.S. and its Western allies will not abandon Ukraine, and thus Russia cannot outlast the West. Once that realization sets in, Russia will be ready to negotiate and offer real concessions. Secondly, continued military aid will allow Ukraine to at least maintain its battlefield positions and thus achieve better terms when negotiations eventually take place.
Okay, so let's turn to the argument for ending aid to Ukraine, assuming that the conflict is in stalemate. Now, this position also has its own assumptions. Like the case in favor of military aid, this position understands that Ukraine's ability to defend itself and maintain the stalemate depends on U.S. military aid. However, unlike that position, this relationship is viewed as a one-sided burden, and advocates of this position believe the United States should not be primarily responsible for Ukrainian defense against Russia, that Europe needs to step up, that Ukraine should be able to defend itself, a variety of different arguments. Now, second, this position also argues that Ukraine's war aims, which include regaining all territory, including Crimea, which was captured by Russia in 2014 and has been held since then, are just too ambitious. It is simply unrealistic that Ukraine will ever have the military capability to regain all of its territories. Moreover, many espousing the position against military aid argue that Ukraine is virtually destined to lose the war, regardless of whether the U.S. continues its military aid or not. And that pessimism fuels this argument that if the U.S. just keeps contributing aid, it will be a participant in a losing cause that will eventually be a waste of money for the United States. Thirdly, and this is related to the previous point, this position argues that the conflict in Ukraine risks another forever war, that is similar to the U.S. intervention in a place like Afghanistan. Unlike those committed to continuing aid, they argue that the costs of such an open-ended conflict outweigh the risks of Ukrainian defeat. If Ukraine goes down to defeat, they would argue that that's preferential and preferred than the U.S. engaging in this open-ended forever war that, in their eyes, could last 20 years or something like that because of the experience in Afghanistan. One thing to note is in Afghanistan, there were American troops on the ground, and there is none here. But that doesn't convince this position, I suppose. Consequently, from this perspective, ending military aid achieves U.S. interests in several ways. First, it forces Ukraine to, in their eyes, face reality and negotiate now, even if the terms are not favorable or acceptable to the Ukrainian government and its people. Some argue that this would at least end the war earlier and prevent further death and destruction in Ukraine in a losing cause in their perspective. Second, they argue also that ending U.S. aid will jumpstart a ceasefire by providing Russia with an off-ramp from the conflict, giving President Vladimir Putin some sort of claim that he could give to his people and claim for his legacy or whatever, that he achieved at least a partial victory by maintaining the lands that they conquered since 2022 and those that they first acquired in 2014. So those are the competing perspectives. That's, I'd say, what moving forward the debate's going to look like. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that.
I mean, I think we should add to this that the long-term health and sustainability of the NATO pact is intimately tied to what's going on in Ukraine. And so you can't separate, and where we started today about, well, I'll just encourage Russia to do whatever the hell it wants against NATO allies. These issues are linked now. And so if there's a substantial pullback in U.S. aid to Ukraine that then leads to Ukrainian defeat and significant territorial concessions on the part of Ukraine to Russia, this is going to raise much larger questions about this. Because NATO has been central in supporting Ukraine, this is going to raise big questions about the long-term sustainability of NATO. And so the pullback of aid to Ukraine is also going to raise doubts about American commitment to that alliance. And again,
and about American political will, against, aggression around the world, right? Aggression against its allies around the world, right?
And I think we have to step back and understand and emphasize the strategic significance of the NATO alliance for America's position in the world. It has been the central political mechanism to defend U.S. interests, U.S. territory around the world since 1949.
And what's interesting about this is there was a debate after the end of the Cold War whether, the NATO alliance was needed anymore, whether it's obsolete or not. The invasion by Russia against Ukraine makes that argument much more difficult to make, that somehow stability in Europe would easily sort of naturally occur from some sort of balance of power without the infrastructure of the NATO alliance in there.
And it's important to think about which country got invaded and which ones didn't.
Right.
A non-NATO member got invaded, the NATO member, and so along these lines, the alliance is doing what it's supposed to do. It's protecting American interests along Russia's borders. And the question then becomes what happens.
Right. And not just in Ukraine, right? I mean, Georgia before it also, there was a military intervention by Russia when it was interested in joining NATO. And so again, there's multiple examples of, that pretty bright dividing line between NATO members and non-NATO.
And the other thing to think about all of this, as the threat environment has evolved and changed after 2001, after 2008, I mean, in the 1990s, post-2001, post-2008, the U.S. has increased its dependence on NATO as the vehicle to confront strategic threats around the world. The long-term vision of challenging, or at least meeting the challenges posed by China, posed by an alliance between China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, the principal strategic mechanism that the U.S. wants to rely on to meet those challenges is its tight relationship with NATO. And so,
if you're not going to defend NATO, you're much less likely to defend these other. Well, they have a shorter history. The obvious ties dating back to World War II. Don't resonate quite as much, etc.
Well, and think about the concerns in the late 1960s and the early 1970s was that Europe was worried about getting bogged down in a war with the United States against the Soviet Union because of the war in Vietnam. And Europe thinks about, well, maybe, and there begins to have a conversation in Europe, maybe we go alone, right? Maybe we opt for some neutrality pact here because we don't want to get dragged into a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Europe is now considering the same thing, right? If we can't trust the United States, then maybe we need to go alone and cut a deal with Russia, cut a deal with China. Then the question becomes, all right, if Europe goes neutral, or adopts a different position relative to China, Russia, an alliance between China and Russia, where does that leave the United States 2 decades from now? Isolated.
Isolated.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's pretty clear, just to be transparent, that at least I'll just speak for myself. I'm a supporter of continued aid for Ukraine. I think it's important to know both arguments, and that's why we presented them in class. And there is a real argument about at what point and how well Ukrainian war aims match the facts on the ground. I just don't agree with the idea that now is the time to end Ukrainian aid because they have no chance of winning. I think the only reason they would have no chance of winning is as a result of ending military aid to Ukraine, not as a reason to do so. So I'll just put my cards on the table.
And the other thing that I would add to this is that even independent of whether or not Professor Moser and I support military aid and the strengthening of NATO, there's a larger question about historically what role has this alliance played in shaping strategic expectations around the world and bolstering deterrence.
Right.
If the alliance breaks down, you get a renegotiation of political relationships, you alter expectations with respect to deterrence, and whether or not you agree with NATO or you think it's bad, you should expect some renegotiations through military force, i.e. war, if all of a sudden there's a question or the United States simply says, we're not going to defend, we're out, we're not going to defend NATO members.
So just to sort of close here, the global repercussions then include all of these things, right? There's specific repercussions for the war in Ukraine. Those two are undermining Ukrainian morale and their ability to fight, and bolstering Russian resolve to continue its war in Ukraine. They're going to be fueled by the idea that they can outlast the West because it looks like the West is starting to wane in its commitment here. It also, when you combine the comments by Donald Trump with the resistance for continued aid in Ukraine, there's a weakening of NATO here and the commitment of the United States in particular to NATO that has ramifications. That ramifications, as we already pointed out, creates potential divisions between the U.S. and other allies as well. I would argue that regardless of whether the United States ends up passing this aid bill or not, some of these ramifications have already occurred. The debate itself and the lingering resistance to Ukrainian aid and the slow passage of this bill, if it ever gets passed at all, has already undermined Ukrainian morale and ability to fight and bolstered Russian resolve and weakened NATO and made given second thoughts. And finally, because of the stark difference between the two leading candidates for president, this raises significance of foreign policy in the election in 2024 because it will have such important consequences for the whole global order.
Yeah, and let's just step back and think about, right, this is one of the reasons we study U.S. foreign policy and we say it has these outsized implications for the international system is the rest of the world is watching these elections very closely, and it's clear that there are going to be very different policies and grand strategies coming from the United States, depending on who wins. And it's also clear that military strategy and decisions about economic aid and military aid depend right now over the course of the next 9 months, depend on expectations about what's happening in the United States. And so we are going to see changes in effort levels. We're going to see changes in battlefield tactics and strategy on the part of both Russia and Ukraine, depending on what poll numbers are looking like in the United States, depending on the legal battles that President Trump is facing. all of these, this is going to make U.S. domestic politics the central part of the global political order over the course of 2024, because the expectation is there's going to be a radical difference in U.S. foreign policy depending on who wins. The stakes are incredibly high. So, anything else?
I think we should end on
We'll
that.
finish there. We would expect that we'll circle back to these issues at some point during the term.
All right.